I just give you a little hint. There are two people that are going to be here tonight for Rayelan Russbacher's workshop that are going to be very interesting people to hear from, along with her.
And it's a very odd feeling because I go on Capitol Hill and it's as though the atomic bomb has been exploded and everybody has, or the neutron bomb, and everybody has been wiped out. And I think the reason I have that feeling is that I have known for many years that the government is not in Washington. It's really in London. And that's why the subtitle of my Secrets of the Federal Reserve is The London Connection. And my subject today is murder by injection, the medical monopoly, the drug trust. And in order to talk about the medical monopoly, you have to talk about the money monopoly. And the money monopoly, of course, is the Babylonian debt system of slavery through money, which is 5,000 years old. And I was very glad to hear Rayelan Russbacher speak about the fact that this is a 5,000 or 6,000 year old conspiracy. I have that in my book, The Curse of Canaan. And also, when she stood up here and told you that the only program that the government has is to exterminate you 250 million Americans, I have to agree with her. And in fact, in 1984, when I published The World Order, that was my conclusion. After the whole book, the last paragraph was that they do have a program of mass extermination for the American people. Now, the government that we have, this shadow government, this hologram government, if you wish, has really ceased to exist. And I say that for two reasons. I was I think the only person to ever point out that the function of government is to protect the gene pool and to protect the borders of the nation from invaders who would contaminate the gene pool. And in fact, this is the basis of all law. If you look at ancient Roman law, what was the origin of Roman law? And I have this in my book, The Rape of Justice. The origin of Roman law was to protect the gene pool. The patricians passed laws because they were the most active and the most energetic and the healthiest of the people. They passed laws forbidding their families to intermarry with the plebeians. And who were the plebeians? They were simply people who didn't know who their parents were. In other words, bastards. So naturally, the patricians did not want their gene pool contaminated by these bastards, so they passed laws. And Rome went through the same process of liberalization and socialism that we have here today, where the plebeians agitated for several centuries to overthrow the laws that the patricians could not be allowed to intermarry with plebeians. And they finally annulled those laws, and that was the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire as we know it.
Several times, and it's being said more and more now, if we don't retain or regain many of the freedoms that we've lost and are in the process of losing, we might not have another conference like this a year from now. Elia Wise, as you've got in your program, was unable to be here this year because she became, as I said in the newsletter, somewhat or slightly pregnant. Rayelan Russbacher is going to take her place. She's not pregnant. We're pretty sure. Okay, enough of that. Her story is serious, and you need to hear it. Rayelan Russbacher and the story of her last 3.5 to 4 years is one that is absolutely beyond belief, except that it's really happened. And it's in this country, supposedly the land of the free. I don't want to say any more because she can tell you the whole story. Welcome, will you, Rayelan Russbacher of Squaw Valley, California.
Hello. Whenever I stand before an audience, I never have any idea what part of our story that I'm going to tell. And this audience is different from any audience that I have ever spoken before. 4 years ago, if I had been asked to speak before this group, I probably would have spoken on the ancient mystery schools, on Egypt, on Atlantis, or on the secret societies of the Middle Ages. These were topics that I had researched both from reading from the Akashic Records. I've been able to do that since I was a child, only the historical part. And these were topics that I had spoken on at places like the United Nations, down in Los Angeles at Manly Hall's Philosophical Research Society. Manly Hall would allow me to present my research whenever I had finished it. And there would be a circle of people out of the Institute that would critique my work. And so this is how I grew both spiritually and in knowledge up until 1989. The reason that I went into that background is for this audience, you would think one thing about me, hearing a story from a CIA wife, but you're going to think another thing about me when you realize that I have been on the spiritual path from the time that I was born. And the teachers that I have had came into my life at very early ages, just as the teachers had come into their lives at very early ages. And so my teachers were in their 80s, 90s, and well over 100 when they began to teach me. And as I said, I walked a spiritual path, a very disciplined, self-disciplined spiritual path for many, many years. Now, for a good part of that time, I was married to a man named John Dyer, who was the Dean of Science and Engineering at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. And by the way, I'm not from Squaw Valley. That's Edie Koenig that's from Squaw Valley. I'm from Carmel, California. During those years, there would be, what should I say, dignitaries from all over the world that would come to the Naval Postgraduate School. And even in order to be married to my husband, John, I had to be cleared to above top secret. And the reason for that is John Dyer is the man who designed the nuclear warfare program for the United States Navy. He also designed the anti-submarine warfare, the electrical engineering warfare program. And so you can see why it was necessary for the United States government to do a background check on me. And they did background checks on me every time John needed to go up for a higher clearance. And so I remember 3 of them that I had to fill out. During the years that I was married to John, there were many parties that we had to attend. At one party, President Ford was there, Caspar Weinberger, Henry Kissinger, ambassadors, congressmen, senators. These were the type of people that attended these parties. Well, there was always a group of naval officers present also. And there was one naval officer that looked an awful lot like Sean Connery. And so I always noticed him when he came. His name was Bob. And I used to love to, shall we say, torment Bob. He would always stand at parade rest, just like this, at the back, at the perimeter. I now realize that he was guarding the perimeter. But he would stand there and never say anything. And so I would go up and I would make comments that every naval officer just loves to hear, such as, "Why, I don't see why they don't allow women on aircraft carriers. And what's wrong with having gays on submarines with the rest of you?" And of course I could see him clench his teeth and get ready to punch me out. But I would always be rescued by someone who would intervene. And then in 1982, there was a new admiral coming on board, and he was an admiral that had been a POW. In fact, he was the second longest held prisoner of war during the Vietnam War. And it was a very big installation. Normally when we have the change of command ceremonies, well, let's just say, they weren't attended by as many people as attended this one. And the one thing that was different about this particular ceremony is naval officers came in from all around the world. They flew in to pay their respects to this man. This was his first command position after being released from Vietnam. And so the officers made a U shape around the podium. It was held outdoors in a very beautiful setting. And all of these naval officers that had flown in were dressed in their dress blues, and they all had their swords at the side. Well, at the end of the ceremony, my husband John needed to go upstairs to get his briefcase. And we walked down the hall to his office, and I stopped in the ladies' room. And as I started out the door of the ladies' room to go back into the hall, there was a sword fight going on in the hall. There were two of these naval officers dressed in their dress blues, and they were having a sword fight. Well, one of the naval officers was the man named Bob, the one that I said looked an awful lot like Sean Connery in those days. Well, he was a lot better swordsman than his opponent and quickly disarmed his opponent, and then a third officer came running up with a couple of snifters of cognac, which he handed to Bob, and Bob quickly salutes me and is just about to speak when my husband John appears, grabs me by the arm, takes a look at Bob, and says, "That's my wife, sailor. Touch her and you're a dead man." And then he pushes me down the hall in front of him, and I said, "Who is that man?" He said, "He's just a spook. Don't have anything to do with him." Well, my husband John had two terms for people in the CIA. One was intelligence officer, and one was spook. And I knew that if he referred to someone as a spook, that was someone that he couldn't stand. Probably because he knew some of the operations that spooks go on, the deep cover operations. Well, skipping ahead a little bit, my husband John died in his sleep in 1988. And for the year of 1989, I traveled around, going through my grieving and recovery and giving lectures and workshops and still seeing my clients. And I was on my way through Medford, Oregon, up to Seattle, when I stopped at a motel called Nindel's. And my mother and I are seated in the dining room when in walks Bob. He stands at the stairs, and there are about 2 steps leading down into that dining room. And he's standing at the stairs with his hands on his hips, looking very much like the naval officer that I had recognized. And so he walks in, and I say to my mother, "I know this man. He's an officer from the Navy school. I used to love giving him a bad time." And so, needless to say, I take up right where I had left off, giving him a bad time. The first thing he tried to do was order some wine, and I told him that anybody who knew anything about wine would never have ordered that wine, a California bulk wine. He puffs himself up about as big as he can be and says, "My family has been in the wine business for 600 years. And I answered, "Well, they certainly weren't in California, were they?" And he looks at my mother and says, "Is she always like this?" And my mother nods and says, yes. And finally, it was at that time that he said, I know you. You're that dean's wife, aren't you? And I said, yes. He says, no wonder. Well, we started talking, and we finished dinner, and I walked my mother back to her room, and Bob and I continued to talk, and I found out that his name wasn't Bob. His name was Günther Russbacher. Bob, he told me, was just a nickname. Well, we talked nonstop for many days, and finally we decided that we were going to get married. He was divorced, and my husband was dead, and we were from the same backgrounds, and there had always been a chemistry between us, and so we decided that we were in love and we were going to get married. He said that because he was attached to naval intelligence, he had to request clearance just to make sure that I wasn't a KGB agent. So when he got back the results of the clearance, permission to marry me had been denied. And I said, I don't understand that. I had been cleared 3 separate times. I'd passed with flying colors. And he said, but that was before you began investigating the CIA. At that moment, the moment that we requested permission to marry, I was working with Barbara Honegger and a CIA contract agent named Richard Brennecke. The work that we were doing was trying to prove that Ronald Reagan's 1980 presidential campaign conspired with Iran to delay the release of the 52 embassy hostages so that Jimmy Carter would be embarrassed in the eyes of the American people, and that Ronald Reagan would squeak by and win the presidency. And of course, that is exactly what happened. And for those of you who remember the swearing in of Ronald Reagan, you will also remember that at that same time, those 52 embassy hostages were freed. And I think that everyone who saw that had the question in the back of their minds, was there a connection? Why did the Ayatollah free those 52 hostages just as Reagan was being sworn in? Well, that was the work that we were working on. As I said, Richard Brennecke, a CIA contract agent, was a friend of mine, and he had just been charged with lying to a judge because he had gone to the aid of another CIA agent who was involved in a money laundering CIA scam. He was following the orders of his CIA control officers, and yet he had just received 42 years in prison for following orders. And so Richard Brennecke went to his defense, and immediately Richard Brennecke was charged with a crime that could have put him in prison up to 15 years. So that was the reason that permission was denied to us. My husband said, Günther told me, we've got a choice. Either we can do what they say and separate for 2 years, and God knows if either of us will ever survive the 2 years, or we can take my plane right now and get married and face the consequences later. At the time, we had no idea what the consequences would be. Consequences so horrendous, so evil, that I can barely believe that either of us have survived these last 4 years. We took the plane, a small modified Learjet painted black with red and silver pinstripes, and flew to Reno. We were married, and an hour later we're on the jet headed back to Seattle. We had been given a bottle of champagne, and I was on my second glass when the pilot turned around and said to my husband, "Chief, our airspace has been violated. We've been ordered to arm." And I thought to myself, what Navy intelligence officer flies around in a plane that can arm itself? What kind of a Learjet can arm itself? I notice my husband looking out the window, and so I look out also. And the fuel pods on the wingtips suddenly began to open, and black missiles extended out of the wingtips. My husband walked forward at that point. I heard the co-pilot say, "Missiles extended, nose cannon fully armed." The pilot turned around and said, "A small prop job has invaded our airspace. Nellis has scrambled a brace of fighters." I was speechless. I had no idea what kind of an airplane that I was on. My husband took my hand and led me back to the couch in the back of the plane. When I sat down, the only thing that I could say was, "What kind of a plane is this?" Because he knew that I had been researching the CIA, because he knew that Richard Brennicky was a friend of mine, he figured that there was no way that he could lie to me. And so he said, "Honey, this is the Blackbird." This was William Casey's personal plane until he died in 1986. And for those of you who don't know that name, he was the director of Central Intelligence. He was also Ronald Reagan's campaign manager, and he is the man that I believe was the one responsible for the delay of the release in the 52 hostages, he and George Bush. My husband went on to say that after Casey died, the plane's been given to me. And I said, "But I don't understand. Why would a CIA plane be given to a naval officer?" And he said, "Up until 1986, I was the number 3 man in the CIA." And I shook my head and I said, "But I've never heard your name before. I know the hierarchy of the CIA. I have studied them. I don't know who you are." And he said, "The hierarchy of the CIA that is published is just the names, the figureheads. The real power is the 80% of the CIA that nobody knows exists, the covert black cover arm of the CIA." He went on to explain that in 1986, one of the airplanes that he owned under an alias, the alias of Robert Andrew Walker, the Bob that I knew, he said that that airplane, a C-130 cargo plane based out of Mena, Arkansas, co-owned by a man named Barry Seal, had crashed in Nicaragua. Now, many of you remember this crash. It was the beginning of the Iran-Contra scandal. There was one survivor, a man named Eugene Hassenfuss. They found all sorts of incriminating documents on that plane that linked the arming of the Contras directly to the CIA. And so another Watergate-type scandal appeared in America. Because my husband was a direct connection to that scandal, the CIA decided that they had to distance themselves from him and they had to discredit him. He had been running a stock brokerage firm out of St. Louis at that time, a company called National Brokerage. And so they shut National Brokerage down and they charged him with stealing by deceit, with being a con man. None of the charges were more than $3,000, and it was from individual clients who had claims against the stock brokerage firm when it was shut down. Now, to give a better picture of this, imagine that you owned a shoe store and you went bankrupt, and you still had the telephone bill to pay, you had the electricity bill to pay, and you had a lot of customers who had ordered shoes, you took their money, and you were never able to fulfill the orders because you went out of business. It would be as if you were indicted and prosecuted and sent to jail for not honoring these small obligations, because these are the types of charges that were brought against my husband. They were only brought against him in 1986 to keep him under their thumb, because the moment he spoke out of school, which is one of their terms, then they would indict him and throw him in prison. And so from 1986 until 1989, when he married me, he was completely under the thumb of the CIA, and he kept his mouth shut. Well, when he violated his orders and not only married me, but began to tell me who he was, they knew that they had to do something about it. And so 2 days after we married, we were in my hometown. We had just had a big family dinner and we were all gathered in the living room when suddenly 30 armed men burst into our living room. If this had been after Waco, I would have been certain that we would have all been burned to death that night. Some of them were wearing FBI t-shirts, these little Izod shirts that should have alligators here and instead had FBI. They looked like they'd just come in off the golf course. Some were wearing county sheriff uniforms, local police, highway patrol, fire department, and then a lot of other men who were just in civilian clothes. They said, "Günther Russbacher, you're under arrest," and they let him out. And then they came up to me and said, "Mrs. Russbacher, your husband is a con man on a crime spree from Missouri to California, marrying and defrauding wealthy widows." And I said, "No, he's not. I've known this man for 10 years. He's a naval officer." And they said, "No, he's not. He's a pathological liar who can take bits and pieces of information and weave them into anything he wants." And I said, "Well, how are you going to explain the missiles in the airplane?" "There were no missiles. You just imagined it." And so, my husband was taken out of my life 2 days after we were married. He was held in a county jail while the FBI came out every day trying to get me to annul the marriage. And of course I was so shaken, and I was living in a small town at that time. I'd moved to my hometown of 3,000 people. It made the front page in the small town. You can imagine the pain and humiliation that my family experienced. I came very close to believing the FBI because they were very, very convincing, and I thought that I had just fallen victim to a very good con artist. But I said to myself, if he's a con artist, why did he marry me? He knew that my late husband didn't leave me anything. What is he trying to get out of me? And so I knew that I had nothing except my career, that he could, there was no money, in other words. Why in the world would a con artist marry a woman with no assets? And yet the FBI came back with their annulment forms trying to get me to annul the marriage. Well, I filled them out, but I didn't sign them. They drove them up, got him to sign them, and just said, "Well, give us a call and we'll go down and we'll testify to the judge that you were a victim and you can get out of this and nobody will be any the wiser." Well, instead of doing that, I called up my friend Richard Brennecke, the CIA contract agent, gave him a description of Robert Andrew Walker. Because I had also seen the FBI rap sheet, I gave him all 26 aliases that I had written down. Richard said, "I'll call you back in a bit." He called me back a few hours later and said that he had put it out over the wire through to his friends, Mossad agents in Israel, Mossad agents in Vienna, CIA agents around the country, and the word was I'd married the banker of the CIA. Shortly after that, I got a telephone call from a girlfriend who said, "One of my friends wants to meet with you." And she gave me the name, and I knew that this man was an Army intelligence officer. I'd known him for years. And my girlfriend said, "He's got some advice for you how you can get yourself out of this mess and still keep your husband." And so hearing that, and my husband had been in jail for about 3 months at that time, maybe 4 months. He'd been held in county jail, and now he was back in Missouri. They'd taken him back there. And through the lawyer's fees and the money mysteriously disappearing out of my bank account, and of course he was hit with IRS liens that took all of his money, all of his property, we were virtually penniless at that time. And so I wanted the situation over as quickly as possible. And so I drove to San Francisco, and I met with this Army intelligence officer, and he said, "You've married the banker of the CIA, and they don't want you married to him. And if you don't divorce him and disappear for 2 years, you're going to be killed." And he went on to say they can't kill him, because if they kill him, he's got all the secret account numbers in his head, and they're going to lose billions of dollars. But they can kill you. And so I'm walking up and down the streets of San Francisco with this man. He said, if they wanted to kill you with a sniper, there would be a sniper on one of these roofs with a silencer, and there'd be a bullet through your head. And if any of you watched the Randy Weaver story last night and know about the FBI assassin who put the bullet through Vicki Weaver's head, you know that there are assassins that work for this government who do nothing but assassinate American citizens. I didn't know that at the time. I was naive. He went on to say, after you're dead on the street, he'll break down the rifle and he'll drop a piece in this sewer and a piece in that sewer, and he'll be on a plane back to Eastern Europe, and no one will ever have any idea who killed you or why. Then he says, and when you're on the way home tonight in your car, you'll have a crazy driver go by you at 100 miles an hour, and he'll run you off the road, and you'll be so thankful that you have survived being run off the road that when the smiling man opens your door, extends his hand to help you out, you'll be grateful as he reaches in and snaps your neck and turns around and says to the other people, if there are any witnesses, "She was dead when I found her." And then, as we begin to walk back to the apartment, I feel something coming up underneath my ribs, underneath my heart. It was such a powerful blow that I thought for sure I had been stabbed. Instead, he pulls his finger out and says, "If this had been a knife, it would have gone straight into your heart and you'd be dead by now." And so at that point I said, "What do they want me to do?" And he said, "Just stay gone for 2 years." So I drove home, scared to death the entire time that I would be run off the road. And I said to my husband, Günther, when he called that evening, "They want me out of your life for 2 years. If I don't leave, they'll kill me." He said, "Wait a minute. Let me check on some things. Let me see who's behind this, and I'll get back to you." Well, he did check on things, and that began the beginning of my SEAL team contingent that is with me at all times. I have anywhere from 8 to 24 Navy SEALs around me, depending upon the seriousness of the situation. Well, it wasn't long after that I was driving my Peugeot, and suddenly I hear a clunk in the car, and I don't have any idea what happened, but I pulled over to the side of the road, and when I stopped the car, the front end of the car fell down, and I realized that the wheel had come off my car while I was driving. There is no way that a Peugeot wheel hubcap can be removed without a special wrench. It's not like American cars that you can snap them off. Well, that was the first attempt on my life. Later on that month, Günther was released from the county jail in a plea bargain and placed on probation. I now realize that the reason that he was released was because the United States government needed him for a mission. We were ordered to Offutt Air Force Base, and on Offutt Air Force Base, we were given a luxury suite, bedroom, small kitchen, living room, right next to William Webster, the Director of Central Intelligence, and on the other side was Brent Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor. For a short time, George and Barbara Bush were across the hall from us. We were very happy to have that room. It was our honeymoon. It was the first time that we had been together in 11 months. And so I didn't really care that the Director of Central Intelligence was on one side and the NSA was on the other side. I was with my husband. I loved my husband. And I wanted to be with him. One morning we got a call from William Webster saying he wanted to meet us for lunch. And so we walked in, and we were met by a colonel who took us into the back room and said, "Sit there." And so we sat there, and they didn't bring us water or menus or anything. We sat there. The place was entirely empty except for us. William Webster walked in, sat at another table. They brought him his lunch. He ate his lunch, nodding to us the entire time. We're sitting there, no water, no menu, no utensils, nothing, at a very hard, hard plastic chairs, while he's sitting in the very luxurious soft chairs. He finishes his dinner and he gets up and he leaves. And I said to my husband, "Is this what having lunch with the Director of Central Intelligence is?" Well, the next morning we get the phone call. We do the whole thing all over again. The Army colonel sits us at the same table, but that time William Webster walks up to our table. He shakes hands with my husband, and my husband says, "Bill, this is my wife, Ray." However, at that same time, an Air Force general, a four-star Air Force general, runs to his side, whispers something into his ear, and drags him away to a table about 3 feet from us. And so, even though I say I've had lunch with the Director of Central Intelligence, he ate his lunch at one table and we ate our lunch at another table. The entire time he and my husband were communicating in sign language, which I haven't ever quite figured out what they were saying. But that is something that you need to know about CIA operatives. They have a language that is just like the language that deaf people use, but it is different. They can talk to each other in sign language, and you think they're just wiping their brow, scratching their ear, touching their shoulder, sort of like what the baseball players do. Well, after a few other experiences on that base, I had just about had my fill of being under their eye at all times. And so I told my husband that I am getting out of here, I am leaving, and I don't care whether you come with me or not. Well, he decided that he would accompany me, and we drove from Omaha, Nebraska to Reno to have another honeymoon without the Director of Central Intelligence listening to every word we said to each other. When we got there, my husband said, "Well, I've got to pick up a flight suit because I've got to fly the Big Bird." And I said, "What do you mean pick up a flight suit? I don't know anything about this." And he said, "Well, that was the agreement that I made for getting out. I would fly this mission to Moscow in an SR-71. And so this is the first I've heard that he even knew how to fly SR-71s. So we go down, pick up a flight suit at the local CIA headquarters. Navy lieutenant commander brought it in and gave it to him. It was the only SR-71 type flight suit in the area. And so I take him out to Reno Municipal Airport, and I see 4 SR-71s come in and land. And I see the little Blackbird, the plane that we had flown to get married in. I see it come in and land. My husband runs out, gets in the Blackbird. The 5 planes line up abreast on this municipal airport and take off straight, almost straight up. It's called a military takeoff. The whole thing could not have been there for it couldn't have lasted for 10 minutes. It was almost like it didn't even happen. Well, he gets back from the mission. It was a mission to Moscow, and by the way, this mission was July 26th, the day after April Glaspie had her famous meeting with Saddam Hussein, the meeting which was never released to the American public. And we've got a Democrat for president now. Why doesn't he release the notes of this meeting to the American public? Well, after my husband returned from this mission to Moscow, in which he carried a treaty to Mikhail Gorbachev, one that had already been signed by George Bush, The telephone rang, I answered it. A man named Admiral Rader said, "Mrs. Russbacher, we've decided that we're going to clean up your husband and keep him in the Navy after all. We're going to promote him to Admiral and give him a command. And in 2 years, he'll be able to retire full Admiral, or Rear Admiral with full benefits." And he said, "All you have to do is report to Castle Air Force Base for a debriefing for the mission and for his command ceremony." Well, like the innocents being led to the slaughter, we followed instructions, reported to Castle Air Force Base in Merced, California, and instead of being met by the people who were going to promote him to Admiral, we were met by the same FBI agent that had arrested him a year before, and he was arrested for impersonating a naval officer. And I said, "We've just been with the Director of Central Intelligence. How can you do this to this man? You know who he is." He says, "He's just a con man. He's conned you. That wasn't William Webster you met. I don't know how you guys got on off it, but he's just a con man." And as he was leading my husband down the stairs, he said to my husband, "Oh, don't worry about these charges. We're not going to press these charges. We could never make them stick. We're just using them to get the state of Missouri to revoke your probation and put you in prison for 21 years. And this is where my husband is right now. During the re-election, when we began releasing things about George Bush, there was an attempt on my husband's life. And up until then, I did not know that my husband was the pilot of the SR-71 that had carried Vice Presidential candidate George Bush back to the United States from a secret meeting in the suburbs of Paris, where George Bush had finalized the October surprise deal with the Iranians to hold those 52 hostages. My husband had not told me his part in this scandal, although I knew that he flew an SR-71 because I saw 4 of them go in and pick him up, and my mother saw him get into one of them and fly away. I knew that he was an SR-71 pilot. So I went on the radio, this was my first radio appearance, and told the audience who my husband was and why they were trying to kill him. As soon as I got out of the studio, back on the freeway, I was on a freeway overpass. I'm a little afraid of freeway overpasses anyway. When suddenly a car came out of nowhere, well, it wasn't a car, it was a blue van, came out of nowhere, speeding about 90 miles an hour, and began to try to run me off that freeway overpass. Another car came out of nowhere and put itself between me and the van and began ramming the van, and ramming it, and ramming it, and ramming it, until the van stopped. A third car came out, a red Firebird, and got right in front of me, hit its brake lights 3 times, and that was my signal. I had already been told if a car ever slows down in front of you, hits its brake lights 3 times, and then speeds off, you are to follow it. Well, I sped off, and we went through San Jose about 110 miles an hour until we got to the road that leads back into Santa Cruz. And then he turned off, and a couple of other cars joined me and followed me all the way home. After that attempt on my life, we began to release even more information, because all of the whistleblowers that I knew said the only way for you two to stay alive is to keep releasing information and keep your names in the paper, keep on radio, keep on television, so that if something happens to you, there'll be so much heat that the people who kill you won't be able to handle the heat. And so we followed the advice and we did this. It was right at a time when my husband was negotiating to release the cockpit video of him and George Bush in the SR-71 flying back from Paris. You see, every SR-71 has a black box that is not just a voice recorder, it's a video and voice recorder. So he had a visual record of George Bush in the back seat of that airplane. I was in the parking lot of a supermarket, just about to load my groceries into the trunk of the car, when a van rams into my car. 3 men leap out of the car, and without warning, there's another man behind me, and there's another man in front of me. The man in front of me says, "Ma'am, would you like me to unload your groceries for you?" He says that while he is staring menacingly at the 3 men that are approaching me. The 3 men that are approaching me get back in the van and run away. I look over my shoulder just long enough to see the man behind me run away, and then the man who had unloaded my groceries joined him as they leaped into a car and took out after the van that had rammed into me. I found out later that the 2 men that were on my side were part of my SEAL team, and they had appeared out of nowhere in seconds. My husband is currently in the Missouri prison. Even though we have a new administration, he is still being held. He is being held because he knows too much, and people are afraid that he will talk. It is not just that he knows scandals about Republicans and Democrats, but he also knows scandals about the Federal Reserve System. And I hope that those of you here will, if you don't already know that the Federal Reserve banks are not government-owned, that you will find that out here at this conference. I will be speaking a little on that on the workshop that I am giving, but Eustace Mullins will cover it far more than I'm going to. Not only does he know about the Federal Reserve, but he knows about the bankers and the oil men who are behind every form of evil that is being perpetrated on the American people. The IRS is the collection agency for the Federal Reserve Bank. The same international bankers that own the Federal Reserve Bank are behind the American Medical Association. Why do you think we have the type of cancer treatment that we have? It is because the people who have leftover waste, such as fluoride from the aluminum that gets dumped into our waters, that actually causes cancer and tooth problems, people who have the leftover byproducts of industrial waste need to do something with them. And so they give them to cancer patients as treatment. The same people who are behind the Federal Reserve are truly behind every heinous, evil aspect that is pervading American life right at the moment. From the television programs, the movies, the violence, the sex, the pornography, the debasement of our society, the breakup of the family. This all isn't an accident. And my husband is the one man that can link all of this together because he's been to the meetings, he's seen it all. And he has now awakened and is trying to tell the American people what is going on here. At the moment, as I said, he is in a Missouri prison serving 21 years. A couple of days ago, he had a second parole hearing. The first one we had, back in June, was denied. Suddenly, 1 month later, a reconsideration hearing happens. Now, why did this reconsideration hearing happen? It was because new evidence was released. The new evidence came over the American Patriot Fax Network in the form of a letter from the former Secretary of State of Missouri. And one paragraph of the letter said, "We know there are no grounds to pursue these charges, but once we hold the press conference and make our statement, he will be totally discredited and nobody will believe them. And if you go ahead with this, talking to the prosecutor to whom the letter is written, we'll make you a judge. I've already cleared it with the Republican committee." And so right at the moment, there is a grand jury convening to indict most of John Ashcroft's cabinet. I'm not sure what the charges are. My husband is going to be one of the key witnesses. The grand jury convenes tomorrow. He testifies tomorrow. Today, representatives from Missouri were with him trying to work out a deal with him that is satisfactory to him. He has been submitted to some of the most heinous and cruel treatment while a prisoner. He was beaten with nightsticks just like Rodney King was beaten. And he was beaten because Ross Perot stuck his nose in, pushed the governor around, and they took out their anger on my husband with nightsticks. They broke his foot in 3 places, put a cast on, which they left on for almost 90 days. They threw him in a strip isolation cell that had cockroaches. The cockroaches crawled inside the cast, laid eggs, began to eat his flesh to the point that he still has scars. In addition, he has a heart condition. They consistently prescribed the wrong medicine and then withheld it. What they were trying to do is create a heart attack so that he would die. And if you remember, I said I met him in 1982 at the change of command ceremony for a POW. Well, the reason all of these men were there is most of them had been POWs also. My husband was a POW. He had his fingernails repeatedly pulled out until they do not grow back. This Democratic administration in Missouri knew that, and yet they assigned him to kitchen duty, which required him to put his hands in boiling water with lye soap. It caused his fingers to swell up, to burst. The pain was excruciating. The stress on his heart was excruciating. My husband is an Austrian citizen. He didn't used to be, but they revoked his American citizenship to try to deport him. Well, his godfather was Kurt Waldheim, and so I begged Kurt Waldheim to do something and get involved. The state of Austria, the government of Austria, filed a formal diplomatic complaint with the State Department, and my husband was released from kitchen duty. But now, with his heart condition, we are fighting 108-degree weather. They do not air condition prisons. Prisoners have no rights whatsoever. I think everyone here in this audience should visit someone in prison to find out what American prisons are like. They are worse than Russian gulags. And so day by day, we live our lives, not knowing whether one or the other of us is going to survive that day. My husband had a heat stroke yesterday and passed out. I did not know that he was still alive until moments before I stepped on this stage. This is the type of tension that we live under. And we are just one family. There are tens of thousands of political prisoners being held in this country. And the political prisoners they consider unrehabilitatable, especially the constitutionalists. You are unrehabilitatable. Murderers can be rehabilitated, but if you believe in the Constitution of the United States of America, you cannot be rehabilitated. What is going on here, people? What is going on is there is a group of powerful, evil people, evil beyond your wildest imagination, who are trying to take over control of the world. And to take over control of the world, they must destroy the United States of America. And that's what they are trying to do. And let me tell you that every one of you here in this audience is on their list. Not because you attended this conference, but because you dare to think for yourself. That's why you're on this list. Those of you who practice alternative healing techniques, those of you who were like me that might be able to read from the Akashic record and understand the real history of this planet, we're on their list. Many have said, if we don't start fighting back right now, this will be another Atlantis. If you remember the Albigensian Crusade at the end of the 12th century, where 12 million Cathars were murdered by the Pope so the Pope could have their land. Well, there are 250 million Americans who are going to be murdered if we don't wake up and begin to fight back. Thank you. I will be having a workshop, I believe it's Friday night, and there are a lot of other things that I know about the New World Order and about the various mind control techniques that are being used to enslave the American people. I hope you come because there'll be time for a lot of questions and answers. Thank you.
I took it out.
Thank you very much.